Thank you ever so much to Ariana for sharing her stories, and for anyone who knows Afghanistan, they will know the incredible courage that she has demonstrated in managing to forge a career like that and to speak out so strongly on what's happened to her country, how it's transitioned, and how right now, as President Trump has said, talks with the Taliban have resumed. The very real possibility of some kind of deal taking place is back on the table. That warning should be listened to by all of you of the need to make sure that there is an enduring political solution to the situation in Afghanistan that involves everybody and not for NATO to walk away. So we're going to change the tone from what we've just heard in Afghanistan back to the sort of future shape of NATO in different domains. NATO declared cyber a domain a couple of years ago, and we know that it's an area, an offensive and defensive area that troubles all of our countries in terms of cyber attacks happening every day. It's a form of this hybrid warfare that people talk about, and yet most members of the public don't really understand that type of attack that's just under the threshold of all-out war and yet subverts democracy. So we've got a fantastic panel led by KLARA Jordan, of the Executive Director for the EU and Africa at the Global Cyber Alliance, and she'll be talking about cyber, defense, offense, and hybrid warfare. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome to the stage the Executive Director, EU and Africa, Global Cyber Alliance, KLARA Jordan.
Good evening, everyone. Is my mic on? Is my mic on? Yes, good evening, everyone. So it's almost 6 p.m. and I know you've all been waiting to hear the C word. We talked about information warfare, we talked about disinformation, and now we're going to address kind of the last element of what we now call modern warfare. So we have three great panelists here today with us. We have Karen Martin, who is the head of UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, TEIJA, who is the Director of European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, and Max SMEETS, who is Senior Researcher at ETH Zurich's Centre for Security Studies. So the panelists will have 2 minutes to deliver their opening remarks, and I will right after that open for questions to the audience, because I know you all have pressing questions on cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, and everything that has to do with NATO's core mission of defense and deterrence. So the first speaker, Karen, will talk a little bit about kind of what it generally means for cyber, all these new tactics of warfare. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clara. There's a great website called haveibeenpwned.com. It's run by an Australian called Troy Hunt, and it tells you if your personal details have been stolen in a hack. You should look it up because you're probably on it. Now, on that site's past form, in the course of both minutes that Clara has kindly allotted me under pain of severe punishment, in the course of both minutes, their cyber attacks globally will cause 16,200 successful personal identity compromises. And experience suggests very little of this will be nation-state activity of strategic significance. But the attacks will damage our citizens, they'll fuel crime, and they'll harm prosperity. And I'm mentioning this not to raise awareness. I think certainly in terms of this audience, we're way past the awareness-raising stage. I said to show we must never forget, first, the link between cybersecurity and digital prosperity, and second, the vulnerabilities inherent in our digital societies. So for me, the absolute prerequisite of changing the rules of the game is to build markedly safer digital homelands across our alliance. NATO has rightly made cyberspace a domain of operations, but cyberspace is first and foremost a peaceful domain. It's not just a platform for our economies and societies these days, it's a fundamental part of them. We live and work online, so we have to keep cyberspace as safe and healthy as possible. Cyber attack capabilities are called viruses for a reason. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a cyber pacifist. The UK was the first country to offer offensive cyber capabilities to NATO, but we're a responsible cyber power. We observe laws and ethical standards that distinguish us from our adversaries. But responsible cyber powers have to use and guard our capabilities carefully. We can't be like the North Koreans with WannaCry or the Russians with NotPetya, launching attacks that spiral out of control with serious unintended consequences. Our free, open societies will always have more to lose from weak defense than our adversaries. We need to make our attackers work harder. Some will be deterred by this. We have to accept others will not, so we need to stop them succeeding. To change the game, even taking to the field requires much better defense.
Thank you very much, Karen. So now we're going to move to you, TEIJA. Tell us a little bit about the hybrid warfare aspect of challenges posed to the alliance, internally or externally, from where you stand at the Center of Excellence.
Thank you so much. I will start with the very basic question concerning why exactly are hybrid threats, hybrid warfare, other forms of hybrid action, why are they so difficult for the target country? We know that it is a phenomenon, hybrid warfare, that operates in the grey zone. It's nothing that we know from other conventional contexts. It is warfare in the grey zone between war and peace. It's hybrid action between the domestic sphere and the foreign sphere. It is information between information and disinformation. So by nature, these hybrid threats are such that it's very difficult for a target country to decide which exactly are the instruments with which it should counter this phenomenon. Also, the normative framework is very unclear. What are the rights and duties applying to such a phenomenon? What are the rights of the targeted country when it's not exactly the typical form of warfare? This element of confusion is a thing that makes this phenomenon very difficult. It is also very difficult for the alliance, NATO, because the means used are not the standard used forms of military aggression. We know that it is attacks against critical infrastructure, it is attacks against the information environment, it is forms of aggression that don't fall into the fields of NATO's competencies. It's tasks. So this is a difficulty for NATO because when we compare the forms of aggression with any other types of traditional aggression, it is a question of essential threat in this case, but it is very much more difficult for the alliance to find the proper responses from the instruments at its disposal. Still, I would like to argue that NATO has sent a political signal to any adversaries. It is exactly as stated by the colleague here. It has defined the cyber domain as one of its operational domains, the cyber element being one instrument for hybrid action. NATO has done a lot also in the broader hybrid field, and the Center of Excellence that I represent forms one part of that agenda where NATO and EU cooperate and try to find joint means to this phenomenon. I want to conclude with deterrence. If we want to respond in our traditional vocabulary, if we want to respond to aggression, deterrence is a well-known instrument there. Why is deterrence so difficult in a hybrid environment? it is being used by building resilience of our societies. NATO is doing that. It also provides a very important political framework for its member states in terms of deterrence by denial. Signal is sent to the adversary. But we also have the other form of deterrence called deterrence by punishment, which is a stronger form of deterrence. NATO has stressed that its willingness to, if needed, use the Article 5, activate Article 5 in a hybrid threat scenario or hybrid threat case. But we also do need to take into account that it's not easy for an alliance with those values as NATO has to use similar instruments as the adversaries use. So deterrence by punishment is difficult also in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this kind of ties it very well to Max. We talked about different instruments that NATO has. We talked about, deterrence by punishment or deterrence by action. I'd love to hear, how you think about how the use of offensive cyber effects within the alliance falls into the defense and deterrence and the overall mission of the alliance.
Yeah. So last year, NATO reached a landmark that went largely unnoticed. There are now more member states which have publicly established a military cyber command or similar unit than there are member states which have not. As my fellow panelists said, there are several countries which have offered sovereign cyber effects to NATO missions and the alliance, and of course at the Brussels summit, member states reiterated the cyber defense pledge and officially established the Cyber Operations Center to be fully operational in 2023. But we shouldn't confuse declaratory policy and even institutional development with an actual meaningful cyber capability. I wouldn't say it's all bark and no bite, but there are certainly too many problems at both the national and NATO level to believe that NATO will be effectively engaging in cyberspace the coming years. Just to put it in context, many of the military cyber commands were established between 2012 and 2014, after Stuxnet, but also at a time of austerity and severe defense budget cuts. Like, cyber was very much seen as a way to stay at the military forefront of war fighting and modern war fighting at a relatively small price. But as we realize today, that's actually not the case. Going cyber is actually pretty hard. For example, it continues to be very difficult to recruit talent, to retain talent. When it comes to exploit and tool development, it's challenging, especially because of the uncertainty of lifespan. And even within nation states, when we think about intelligence sharing between intelligence agencies and military cyber commands, we see an enormous amount of challenges. And lastly, as was said, still many of the strategic questions remain unanswered. It's still not clear to what degree cyber deterrence is an effective strategy at all, especially in a space where we are already constantly engaging, where we are not even trying to dissuade the adversary from conducting a certain activity because they're already doing so on a constant basis. There are many other questions. Think about to what degree we can use offensive cyber operations as maybe a counter force or even a counter value option.
Thank you, Max. So Max highlighted some of the progress and some of the challenges. I'll ask my first question in a minute, but I'll start to ask for a raise of hands for questions. We talked a little bit about the progress, and NATO has made significant progress. If you think about it, and in 2012, it was the first time NATO said, oh, we need to strengthen our cyber capabilities. NATO was in a phase of awareness. Then in 2016, we talked about cyber as a domain of operations. And we're now in 2019 talking about using sovereign cyber effects. So what do you think is next in terms of really operationalizing the capabilities offered? What do you think NATO has to do as a next step in this space? Any of the three?
Please. Well, so it starts, of course, at the national level, right? Again, as we've been mentioned a couple of times today, it's not NATO who owns most of the capabilities. And there, when we think about what we see at the national level, first of all, it's, as a military commander said, it's about people, people, and people. And we have made mistakes in the past. Many of these military cyber commands were established and were recruiting people from a variety of other military forces. So you basically brain drain from all those other military forces some of your most important IT talent, and then what you do, you provide a perfect recruitment platform for private sector companies who are also in dire need of that talent to recruit from. So you're actually losing a lot of the capabilities that you want. So one is, of course, continuing to invest in that. Now that comes, of course, with huge problems. Not least, it's very difficult to replicate talent. Many of the skills, the most important skills of operators, developers, and system administrators were retained at simply working together on GitHub, doing some code sharing, going to a conference, going to another hacker event. It's going to be really tough to put that kind of in a formal training program. But today, many of the training programs are literally 3 to 9 months long, and then they're pushed into a cyber command. We have to do better. We have to invest much more in that. And I think that's also a space where many of the NATO members can work together and are not doing that enough right now.
That's great. So let's start with the first question here. Then the gentleman.
Thank you. My name is George. I'm the Information and Cybersecurity Consultant and representing Georgia. My question is regarding the Article 5 and its invocation when it comes to the cyber. So, as you mentioned, there are too many unclarities and some blurry things regarding the cyber issues. But as we see, like almost 3 years, like NATO officially declared the cyber as a operating domain. So there are huge problems, there are huge issues regarding the attribution, regarding the proportional response, regarding the consequence and the magnitude of the attacks and so on. So I will not go into details. One thing, what I really think that it should be like the baseline and it should be start from that. So the Article 5, which is based on the armed attack notion, yeah? So how do you think, how long it will take to determine and to set the clear and strict determination of the armed attack in the cyber? Because all we hear about the armed attack should be like case by case, and we should just decide case by case the things, but it really brings more unclarities when it comes to the cyber. So how do you think when it's possible to have the clear and strict notion of armed attack in the cyber? It's not an easy question, yeah, I know.
No, I think it's a hugely difficult question, but a very important one. And I wonder whether there is a political will within the allies to make or agree on such a strict definition of when, what kind of an attack does it need to be. Also from the hybrid perspective, the cyber instrument is used in concert with many other tools, critical infrastructure attacks. And it might also be that it is a combination of attacks simultaneously that triggers the use of the Article 5. But I think it's, I don't see any great willingness. Perhaps colleagues know more about a definition of when the threshold exactly is reached.
You know, and before giving a floor to Max, I'll just say that states have a huge responsibility to talk about their understanding of international law. And there are many states who has done it. I think the UK's Attorney General recently talked about the UK's understanding of what, how international law applies to cyber. I mean, it's up to each member state to talk about that. And that's how you kind of create the understanding of what it would be. That would facilitate answering those questions. Max.
Yeah, and it's not just about being unclear about red lines and when Article 5 is triggered, but it's also how we would respond in those cases. And this uncertainty, some have argued, leads to more deterrence, right? The adversary is not entirely clear on when and how we will respond, and hence doesn't do so, which stands in stark contrast to many of the discussions that we had during the Cold War, particularly in relation to nuclear weapons, where we famously talked about the crystal ball effect that led to deterrence. It was the certainty of a certain effect that would be caused, the enormous havoc that would be caused after it that led to a certain amount of deterrence. Having said that, I actually don't think that the biggest problem is when Article 5 is triggered or not. It is exactly the issues that we've mentioned here today. It is all that activity that is taking place below the threshold of armed attack, yet is still strategically meaningful. And that is something that NATO is grappling with today, and how to respond to that.
Anyone there?
Thanks, Clara. Pete Cooper, Atlantic Council. At the heart of NATO's collective action is the ability to conduct joint operations, multi-domain, multinational, at speed, and across a large geographic area. With space and cyber as new domains of operation, is it now time for NATO nations to start considering what a force construct and C2 looks like for parity across all of these different domains, if it's to maintain the ability to conduct agile operations and maintain workforce?
Take that?
Sure. So it's a dangerous one. Of course, every country now needs to operate at as quick as they can and have freedom to maneuver, or what the US Cyber Command recently proposed is to operate continuously, globally, and seamlessly. The danger in this space is that it is, and particularly cyberspace I'm now talking about, is that it is not like conventional domains, right? So when General Nakasone talks about also defending forward in cyberspace, like our navies are not patrolling or not at the harbor, but also patrolling at the sea, it's very different in cyberspace. The moment you go outside of your own networks, you're into someone else's networks. And that's a big difference, especially when we move away from not just being in allied networks, potentially as an ally for kind of observing reasons, for espionage, but also doing this for effects reasons, to be a disruptor, to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy. And we've seen particularly the US moving in that direction with its recent strategy of persistent engagement and defend forward, arguing that they need to cause friction wherever the adversary maneuvers, but that area could also be allied networks.
I would just add to that, and I agree entirely with what Max just said. If you're looking at things from the perspective of a senior military commander and thinking about potential operations, you will ask a question like that, and you will be framing your capabilities in that sort of way. If you're in charge, as I am, of the national cyber defense of a country, including strategic capabilities, including helping the Ministry of Defense protect armed forces capabilities, but you're actually also trying to protect the digital environment of an advanced economy, you have to take a much more nuanced and social and subtle approach, thinking about those networks that you're traversing on, thinking about the fact that most of the threatening activity will fall way below law of armed conflict, triggering Article 5 and so forth, thinking about, frankly, the commercial and economic realities of what you're doing. So, yes, of course, in terms of thinking of the future of NATO as a military alliance, these sorts of issues will evolve, but thinking about us as an alliance of like-minded advanced digital economies, we have to think in a different way as well.
So let's start with questions. The young lady at the back, please, and then we'll have a microphone back there for the next question, and then at the back.
Thank you, TEILIKAINEN, researcher at the IAA in Dublin. I have a question with regard to human resources and talent, the market failure that you mentioned, Max, which is quite relevant. So how can you actually reconcile the disparate resources, or the resources gap as such, both the private sector and in the States? There's a brain drain at present, go away from the brain death comment, and how can we actually find common ground and, essentially consolidating reputational risk, which is a common interest for both states and for private sector? Thank you.
You want to talk a little bit about what you've done for the talent at your centre?
Yeah, I don't like pessimism about cyber skills. I mean, we've got what we've got, and a lot of us, a lot of countries represented in the alliance are doing okay. We need to defend digital homelands better. We need elite defenders, but we need good enough defenders, and we need elite military capabilities. We also need ones that are necessary for just persistent engagement, defending forward, and so on. So let's not be overly pessimistic on this. We're trying to, in the UK, build two pipelines, if you like. The elite pipeline, intervening at a very early age in the school system, particularly in the female half of the population that's woefully underestimated on all sides of the cyber skills spectrum. Career paths in national security, but we include in that industry, and so forth. But then just looking at, for the vast majority of people in any of the societies across the alliance, we will not be looking to most people to wake up every day and think about cybersecurity or think about contesting cyberspace. We'll be asking them to think about something else that's of national value, and we need to train them to be, even if it's just getting their phone out of the pocket after the meeting, to be digitally savvy. And that's a completely different skill set. And so that starts partly with the education system, it starts partly with large-scale training programs, but it starts partly with incentives, with regulation to get that right. It's a full national ecosystem, and I wouldn't be as pessimistic as sometimes the general consensus on this implies.
Thank you. The question at the back, please.
Piret Kuusik, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, ICDS. How should we approach the thinking or the question on whether NATO is the fit format for these challenges? Where does the line go? Does NATO have to fight financial crime? And how do you decide that line? Thank you.
I think NATO certainly belongs to the key actors, in my view, in the field, because by taking responsibility in this threat environment, NATO shows that it is capable of adjusting to changing conditions, and this is certainly what it tries to do. It's also the defense alliance of its member states, and when the threats are changing, it's adjusting. But of course, in this environment, it cannot protect its member states alone. It has been pointed out here that cooperation with EU, but also cooperation with private sector actors in this threat environment is more and more important. So partnerships of new type will be necessary for NATO, but still I think with regard to its basic treaty and the obligations there, it is the one that takes this responsibility, and it should do.
Yeah, it certainly has an important responsibility, but we shouldn't, as you may be referring to, militarize all the problems, right? And so it's a difficult balance, and I think we see this with the questions such as resilience too, where of course depending on the specifics and what type of resilience we're talking about, maybe resilience against cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, or resilience, as the previous panel talked about, disinformation operations, where we address very different entities. We need to be aware of where NATO kind of stops and ends, and as much as I see an important role for NATO, there is a danger of kind of overextending that too.
So we'll take the last question there at the back, Sven.
Thank you. I'm Sven Zakov, International Center for Defense and Security, a think tank in Tallinn, Estonia, formerly at NATO Cyber Center of Excellence. And two short comments. First is on deterrence in cyberspace. One of the speakers said that he's not sure whether it works in a cyberspace. I don't think there is any reason why it should work in a cyberspace. In the same way as if a land threat is not to be deterred only on land, it has to be a multi-domain deterrence. And the second comment is on a threshold of Article 5 for cyber attack. I mean, essentially Article 5 is always a political determination. And I think what the leaders will look at that is the effect of attack, not the domain through which it materialized. So I would say that if a cyber attack blew up a nuclear power station, effect of that would be catastrophic, and I think then this is over threshold. Otherwise, setting a threshold on such a matter invites adversaries to play just below it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any last reaction? Let's do a quick round of...
A couple of quick responses. Firstly, on the pragmatism about your approach to Article 5, I think that must be right, and it goes wider than that. When I started the National Cybersecurity Centre and was planning for what sort of major incidents we'd have to respond to, and I'm not making an Article 5 point here, we didn't predict that our first one would be a North Korean ransomware attack that went wrong and hit the health service in this country, and I think we could model all sorts of things that might test Article 5, and then reality will contradict you. And I think on the wider point about deterrence, some people will be deterred, some people will have to work harder and they'll give up, but some people won't be deterred, and particularly as we worry about proliferation of cyber tools, which I think is one of the big strategic issues of the 2020s. We've just got to make sure that the attacks don't work.
Any last comments?
Well, from the hybrid environment perspective, I want to stress that cyber realm and cyber field is one of the instruments that are being used there, and the difficulty with this hybrid environment is that when a set of instruments are being used simultaneously, it's a huge challenge, as we all know, to a society, and that's why we need all of these systems of cooperation. Also, it's an interesting question whether including something in the tasks of NATO currently means a militarization of the issue. This is perhaps something that we need to think about. With regard to the cyber approach of NATO as well, it's quite far from its original tasks with these duties.
Last 10 seconds, Max.
Yeah, no, I may have been, I didn't want to be overly pessimistic or negative about NATO's developments, and I just wanted to quote Ambassador Soren de Caro, who is also sitting here in the room, who said a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago, talking about offensive cyber used to be kind of blasphemy. You wouldn't talk about it at all. We were talking about within NATO about cyber defense until maybe 3-4 years ago, but certainly not cyber offense. And so we've come a long way, and we may have still a long way to go, but that's important to keep in mind.
Well, join me in thanking the panelists for this very informative 30 minutes. Thank you.